From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Donald Trump's choices for his cabinet are nearly complete after a rush of appointments late Friday, including hedge fund investor Scott Bessent for Treasury Secretary. What do the choices tell us about the unfolding second Trump administration, its priorities, and how it will be different from the first term? Welcome to Potomac Watch, the Wall Street Journal Opinion Podcast. I'm Paul Gigot, editor of the Opinion Pages, and I'm here with my colleagues, Kyle Peterson and Alicia Finley. Welcome to you both. Well, Donald Trump keeps confounding people as they try to analyze his choices. Axios calls his cabinet a liberal cabinet. Wall Street seems relieved, judging by the stock market reaction on Monday. The New York Times calls it one part revenge, one part reassurance, and one part cutting the size and scope of government. I'm not so sure the Times is right about any of that, but my own view is that it's a very Trumpian mix. It's fewer mainstream choices than in his first term, when he didn't have as much confidence, I think, in his choices and did not have as large a Rolodex of people he could call on. He is now indulging very much his own kind of person, his own selections, some of whom are based on loyalty, some of whom are based on the fact that they really helped him a lot in the campaign, either with donations or on the stump. I think that applies to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. at HHS and Tulsi Gabbard as the Director of National Intelligence. And some of those are going to be controversial choices. Tulsi Gabbard for sure, RFK Jr. for sure, Pete Hegseth at Defense. That's the Fox News portion of his selection. He does like people who are telegenic. Alicia, what's your overall impression of the cabinet picks?
Well, I think what Trump is looking for most, and I don't think this is necessarily a good thing, is wealth and fame and celebrity. Several of them come from Fox News. You have some who are disruptors and who were pushed by Donnie Jr. and Vance, put Mehmet Oz, CMS director, RFK in that category. He may even think Hegseth at DOD because of his opposition to the wokeness in the military. So he's looking for a disruption in a certain respect, but there are more conventional picks. For instance, at Energy, Chris Wright, as well as Interior, Doug Burgum. Most of all, I think you see a lot of loyalty. He wants people who are loyal to him and will do what he wants.
And Kyle, how about you? What's your kind of big picture take on the cabinet and all its various complexity?
It strikes me as a mix. There are more than a handful of people in here who are classic cabinet nominees you can imagine in any other Republican administration, members of the House or the Senate of the president's party who are now being elevated to a higher profile post. Marco Rubio for Secretary of State might be a pretty good example of that. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum, Doug Collins at Veterans Affairs. And then there are some real wild cards. It seems like Trump is trying to do outreach to different elements of the Make America Great Again coalition, if I can put it that way, who might not be traditional Republicans. And so you have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for the health secretary, longtime Democrat from a Democratic family, Tulsi Gabbard as director of national intelligence, and this labor secretary, Lori Chavez DeRemer, who's supported bills in Congress that look to my eye like union giveaways. It is striking to have people in your cabinet, people you're nominating for your cabinet, who have different views on the kind of policy agenda that you as the incoming president have put forward or have been critics of them. Tulsi Gabbard, a very strong critic of what Trump did in his first term.
Yeah, it is certainly a polyglot mix, Alicia. Who do you think is the best nominee?
I'd either put Doug Burgum at Interior or Chris Wright at Energy.
Why?
Both of them have business experience. They are both very opposed to kind of this crony capitalism, which I think is very important in those jobs. In energy? Energy in particular, because one of the jobs will be to scrap this $400 billion, I would call it a venture capital fund, but it's a loan guarantee fund like the Biden administration has been using to subsidize all kinds of companies, often who have Democratic donors. But you're going to see a lot of companies also over the next 4 years, maybe Exxon and such, line up and try to get money for their own kind of investments in hydrogen capture. And I think it's really important that you have someone who's opposed to that in that job. Burgum, he's very smart. He has experience running a business, North Dakota, is the third largest oil and gas producer in the country. So he understands energy markets. He's a very strong supporter of deregulating, which I think is probably his top priority as Interior, responsibility over all federal lands and a lot of energy production. So I think that if you really want to drill, baby, drill, as Trump says, you really have to have someone in that job who will deregulate the land development, increase leases and such.
And Kyle, who do you like most in the cabinet nominations?
I think those two are great picks, Doug Burgum at Interior and Chris Wright at Energy. I might have put Burgum at Energy instead, but you can understand why Trump would choose Wright. A couple that I would add are John Ratcliffe as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He served in the first Trump administration as the director of national intelligence, so he has some subject matter expertise. He has some credibility on these intelligence questions, and he's a Trump guy for coming back for the second term, so Trump feels like he can trust him. I would also add Marco Rubio at Secretary of State. I've been somewhat skeptical of the populist turn on economics that Rubio has made in recent years, but he could be a decent Secretary of State, I think. In the past, he's been very vocal about pro-America views, pushing back against rising authoritarian nations. His family ties in Cuba are interesting there. He can go out on the world stage and make the case that the U.S. system works and it's better than these rising authoritarian countries that are trying to challenge the U.S. system.
Well, of course. But I agree with your choices. I would point out Mike Waltz at the National Security Council, member of Congress, former military service member. He has, I think, a fairly hawkish view towards the world and our adversaries. We'll see how that plays out with Trump. But I think Rubio and Waltz are going to be crucial in some of these internal councils advising Trump to make a too premature withdrawal from support for Ukraine, for example. And they'll have to manage the U.S.-China relationship in a way that enhances deterrence. It's going to be interesting to see how they go. All right, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk about who we think is the worst nominee of President Trump when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with our Potomac Watch podcast here with Alicia Finley and Kyle Peterson. My choice for the worst pick, there are several possibilities here, but I think the Labor Secretary, Lori Chavez DeRemer, current member of Congress, she lost her re-election bid in Oregon, kind of a Republican in name only. Kyle referred to her as pro-labor. I disagree with that framing. She is pro-union, not pro-labor. She is not pro-worker. She favors the PRO Act, which is the Democratic bill that passed the House that would repeal right-to-work laws in 26 states. That's the law that allows individuals to join a union or not, as opposed to being forced to pay union dues. All kinds of bad things in that bill. So she's my nominee for worst. How about yours?
Tough decision between her and RFK at HHS. On one hand, I think he's unqualified. So was Xavier Becerra, Biden's pick for HHS secretary. And it really depends on what RFK decides to do in the position. He may be in completely over his skis because he's really never had any management experience, so he may not be able to even manage effectively these sprawling bureaucracies, which include the FDA, CMS, NIH, but oversight of all of that. What troubles me, obviously, is some of his views on vaccines, but they also go to his views on GMO, genetically modified organisms or crops, and actually FDA does have some authority over, approvals of those, and he's said things about sunscreen, that the chemicals in sunscreen are hazardous, and FDA also has approval authority over that. It could cause a lot of damage in various respects, not least of all to the drug development and a lot of promising innovations and cures, including gene therapies. And he seems to be a little skeptical of technology in general and seems to want to take us back to Amish living. And I think that that's worrisome. And I think the markets have reacted by selling off biotech stocks since he was tapped. But I think it really, again, depends on if he actually gets confirmed, and I'm skeptical of that as well, and then how effective he is in his position.
I just want to make one extra point on Labor Secretary Lori Chavez DeRemer. I forgot to mention that Randy Weingarten, head of the teachers union, has given her endorsement, which is almost by definition means it's a bad choice. But Kyle, who would you have thumbs down on?
Well, I would have said Matt Gaetz, but the Senate seems to have done a pretty good job of advise and non-consent on that choice. Matt Gaetz now withdrawing as the Attorney General. Number two, I guess I would say RFK Jr., and part of that is because many of the things that this Labor Secretary pick wants to do, I think would be negatives for the labor market, but I think that her unilateral power is maybe lower. You can't pass the PRO Act as the Labor Secretary. You have to go to Congress and get something like that done. Whereas the head of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I think would have that post has, I think, some pretty broad powers. And he's somebody who is very pro-abortion. He has supported single-payer health care, moving the U.S. toward more government healthcare provision. And there are all sorts of calls that get made within those health agencies. And I'm not even talking about stuff like approval of vaccines and stuff. I'm talking about waivers that states want. They want to operate their Medicaid program a slightly different way. And there is broad discretion in the Health and Human Services office to make calls on those sorts of things. And so I think the Senate ought to have some pretty solid questions for RFK Jr. if we get to these confirmation hearings on how he would approach those things.